information before our next midterm. Today's all about Darwin, so let me go ahead and turn the camera off and we're going to start. Okay, evolutionary biology. We are now going to have our first lecture on evolution. And you really are kind of at a crossroads right now in this class, a very, very important crossroads. Evolution really is the foundation for understanding all of biology. It doesn't matter what branch of biology you're talking about. I'm just giving you a smattering of examples here. These branches of biology all make sense because of evolution. In fact, in the words of a famous evolutionary biologist of about 100 years ago, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. Now, why are we introducing evolution now, here in this particular week, instead of starting out in the very first week talking about evolution? Because there is so much that you had to learn up until this point. Let me tell you why you are uniquely qualified to understand evolution now, whereas your friends, who may not have taken biology from me, will not have been as uniquely qualified. Okay, here's what you know. You know about meiosis. I kind of impressed upon you the importance of meiosis and how it relates to evolution. This is all about genetic change and variation, changing of the DNA and packaging unique things or unique combinations of DNA into gametes. Number 2, inheritance, Mendelian inheritance. You understand how traits get passed from one generation to the next. Number 3, you understand the structure of DNA and how it's put together, how it replicates itself, and more importantly, you understand how DNA controls the synthesis of various proteins, etc. So this is really a DNA recap here. Here's one page of DNA. You understand that DNA is the blueprint for all life on the planet. All living organisms have the same parts in their DNA, just expressed in different combinations. Remember Chargaff's rule? Well, you might all have different amounts of DNA, but the ratios of A's to T's are the same. The ratios of G's to C's are always the same. And so the rules for how DNA works all are the same. The same 20 amino acids, right? The same genetic combination, the same reading frame is all the same. It doesn't matter what organism you're talking about. All right, so to truly understand this, we need to take a little bit of a trip through history. Let's talk about the dogma of the ancient day. A long, long, long time ago, actually not that long ago, only about 150 years ago or so, the general dogma of the day was that the earth was fixed. It didn't move, it didn't change, it was basically set in stone as is, as a result of divine guidance. This was true for the continents, it was true for the ocean, and without getting too far afield here, the question really came down to how old is the earth? Well, we were getting all kinds of conflicting evidence from geologists that were working in the early 1800s that were recognizing things that were occurring on the planet that could not possibly have occurred within the biblical context of the earth. And let's face it, breaking from dogma is really hard. What is dogma? Dogma is the conventional way that everybody thinks of that particular day. Well, the Pope, realizing that there was this conflicting evidence, and he had to come up with an explanation for why the Earth was the way it was, he went out and he sought a biblical explanation for the natural world, and he hired a guy by the name of James Ussher, who was an Anglican archbishop, and he looked back through the Bible, counting all of the begets and the begats in the Bible, and he determined that the earth must have been born. If the biblical texts are correct, the earth must have been born on October 23rd, 4004 BC. Now, how long ago was that? Well, not that long ago, right? In fact, it means that the Earth is 6,016 years old as of this coming October. So yay, Earth, The Earth doesn't look a day over 4.5 billion. Okay, that was meant to be a joke, because 4.5 billion years is now what science currently tells us, what the evidence currently tells us, is the age of the Earth. 4.5 billion years old. That's billion with a B. And, just for fun, if you want, you can actually go into Excel and put today's date in one cell, and then in the cell below it, put yesterday's date in, and then grab those two and drag it all the way back until you get to October 23rd of 4004 BC. And believe it or not, it was a Tuesday. Just saying. Anyway, this is really kind of a bad scientific approach. We don't want to get too down on James Ussher because he was simply working with the information he had. But remember, this is the way that science is supposed to work. You're supposed to make observations first, then draw a hypothesis from those observations. Hypothesis is not necessarily correct. It's simply the best explanation you have for the observation. Then you run an experiment to test the hypothesis, and you get your results, and you draw your conclusions afterwards. However, this is the way that science was done 150 years ago. You made your observations, and you drew your conclusions beforehand based on biblical texts, and then you drew your hypothesis from that. That is not the way that science is done today. Some of the conflicting, troubling observations that were made included all kinds of things. Like, for example, having marine fossils 8,000 feet up on a mountainside. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense, right? And also, the very fact that we have probably somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million described species today, how could any of those be accounted for on Noah's Ark? Also, the fact that we look in the fossil record and we see forms of animals that don't exist today. Well, that's problematic. If the Earth is in fact perfect and unchanging, then you wouldn't expect to find fossils, would you? In addition, there appear to be anomalies in living organisms. What you're looking at here is a fin whale at the LA County Museum of Natural History. And this is my little girl right here, my little vertebrate. And she is noticing that hanging down from this whale is a hip bone. Well, that seems kind of weird. Why would you need hips if you are a whale swimming through the ocean and you don't have back legs? Well, that shouldn't be there if whales are designed as perfect organisms by divine intervention. And yet, whales all have hip bones. So geologic discoveries started unraveling the old way of thinking of things. And we were noticing way back then that there were similar rock layers that were found throughout the world, and that if you dug in one rock layer, you tended to find fossils of a particular variety, and they were the same fossils that were found elsewhere in the world in the exact same rock layer. Now, also, is the deeper you go in those rock layers, the older the rocks get, and hence the simpler the fossils become. It seemed to be that in the olden days, organisms were more simplified, and that as the organisms moved through history, they got to be more diverse and more complex. Fossils also seem to be related to known species of today, but not all of those fossils were alive today. So there appears to be some sort of changes that are occurring through geologic time. Now, all of this new evidence, clearly some reconciliation had to occur, and there were lots of people that were kind of sought out to give explanations. And one such example is this guy right here, George Cuvier. And Cuvier came up with this concept of multiple catastrophes. This is his explanation for how you can reconcile the evidence, for example, of marine fossils on the top of a mountaintop with biblical accounts. And in this case, you're looking at the Noah flood, where here is Noah's Ark, and this is his explanation for how you get marine fossils, is that the earth flooded tall enough that at 8,000 feet up in the Alps, that's the explanation for why it is that there are fossils up there. Of course, that didn't explain very much, and however, the church really did like this explanation because it didn't conflict with the present level of knowledge. But there were a lot of people that kind of came up with new ideas, and one in particular is this guy right here, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And Lamarck was an incredibly gifted scientist who thought of new ideas for how organisms could potentially evolve. And Lamarck's revolutionary idea really was that organisms could actually change over their lifetime. Now, this is completely heretical, right? Think about it. The church of the day is basically saying everything is fixed in stone, nothing changes over its lifetime, everything was made perfect. And here's Lamarck saying, no, actually that's not true. Things change over their lifetime. Now, it turns out that Lamarck got it wrong. His mechanism wasn't correct, but it was really novel for him to even think that organisms could change over their lifetime. As an example, here you have a giraffe, and this giraffe has a really short neck. And you could imagine in Lamarck's mind here, he's thinking of a giraffe, and this giraffe really wants to eat those leaves of that tree, really, really wants to get there. So it stretches its neck over time, over its lifetime, from its adulthood on into its middle age, let's say, and it's continuing to stretch until eventually it can reach those leaves, right? And then somehow, this longer-necked giraffe is able to pass on its essence or something about itself to its offspring, its long-neckedness, if you will. However, we know that an organism is not going to change throughout its lifetime. Think about it. What is it about you that does not change from the day you're born until the day you die? Hopefully you have the answer. The answer is your DNA. Your DNA does not change from the time you're born till the time you die. If your DNA is not changing, then you are not evolving. Does that make sense? So if you want to kind of do this experiment in your head to test Lamarck's idea, then all you have to do is go out, and I recommend you do this, go to a pet store, get 2 rats, and take them home, get a boy and a girl so that they can make babies. And before you get those rats to come together and make babies, take a kitchen knife and cut off their tails. Okay, you don't really have to do this experiment. This is just a thought experiment. But if you cut off the tails of those rats and then make them do whatever it is that rats do and make babies, the babies that they make, are they going to have tails? Of course they are. Because when you cut the tails off the rats, you did not change the DNA of the rats, right? So we know that heredity has to do with DNA, but in the days of Lamarck, they didn't know what DNA was. They had no clue. So this is where Lamarck was wrong. He thought that the changes occurred in individuals over their lifetime, but in fact the changes occur somewhere else, which we'll get to in a little bit. However, we should credit Lamarck with even suggesting that things change over time. Lines of descent in fossils in modern form. This is what he saw. So he knew changes must have been occurring. He just had the wrong mechanism. We now know that that what he was referring to is environmental influences. And so, for example, this is a classic example, is that's a bonsai tree right there. It looks small, right? It looks different from other trees. But the reason why it's small is because the roots have been clipped and it has been very artfully trimmed at the top. If you were to stop trimming that tree and let it grow, it would grow tall just like any other tree because you didn't change its DNA. Now, let's come to Darwin. Darwin, amazing character. He was actually born the exact same day as Abraham Lincoln, which is funny because just a few months ago when everybody was celebrating Lincoln's birthday, President's Day, in my household we were jumping up and down and singing praises for Charles Darwin. We were singing happy birthday to him. And I actually have a video online which you can link to from Blackboard. But anyway, Darwin was an interesting character. He dropped out of medical school. But I got to back up a little bit here. Darwin came from an aristocratic family. His dad was really famous. His grandfather was really famous as a biologist and a physician. And Darwin's father pretty much knew that his son had four options. This is really all you had when you were growing up in an aristocratic family like that. Number one, you could be a lawyer, right, and work for the king. Number two, you could be a businessman. And you could also be a clergyman, or the last thing is you could be a physician, a doctor. Well, Darwin had a very easygoing personality. He was the kind of kid that got beat up on the playground, okay? So he wasn't really into conflict. He was very soft-spoken. His dad knew full well he would not make a good businessman, and he would definitely not make a good lawyer. And he didn't have leadership skills enough to go into the clergy, he felt. So, med school it was. Well, med school was great for Darwin. He thought that was a fine idea because he was actually really good with science. And ever since he was a little kid, he would go to the Royal Museum in London, and he had seen every fossil and every skeleton of every organism in that museum, and he loved beetles. He had a beetle collection when he was 10 years old. He actually enjoyed looking at barnacles. So, okay, he's a science person. Med school, no problem. What do I got to do? Memorize a few bones and a few muscles? That's perfect for him. So he manages to go to med school, and in the first year, he just knocked it out of the park. He was learning the anatomy, learning the physiology. He was doing great. Then the second year came, and Darwin actually had to witness a surgery. He witnessed a man getting his leg sawed off because the person had a problem with his foot. Back then, there was no such thing as anesthetics. So you could imagine the screaming and the yelling and the absolute pain and the blood and gore. Well, Darwin, being kind of an easygoing person, he left halfway during the surgery, ran outside, puked in the bushes, and never went back to med school. So his father's really stressing about this. Well, what's my son going to do? So he figures, you know what? The clergy, they actually run the universities, and so maybe that's the best place for my son. So instead, because of his childhood fascination with nature, the only way to study nature was for Darwin to go into the clergy. And go and check out that YouTube video online. It's actually quite funny. Okay, let me bring one other character into this. Sir Charles Lyell. Lyell was not a biologist. In fact, he was a geologist who studied rocks. And he worked for the king, and his job was to plan cities and stuff like that, and, get to know the hillsides, how to cut into the hillsides to build houses, etc., stuff like that. But because of the kind of work he was doing, he got to see geology like no other working geologist. He was like a geologist who actually worked on geology, and he wasn't just a professor. He did that too. But from what he was observing out in the field, he realized that the formation of rocks and hillsides and mountainsides was actually dynamic. Things were changing. But in order for the changes to actually occur that he was seeing, it had to occur over much longer periods of time than the Bible would allow. Remember, everybody at the time just accepted that the earth was 6,000 years old. And yet here is Lyell saying, no. The earth cannot be thousands of years old. In fact, the earth has to be millions of years old in order for these geological phenomena to occur. Well, it turns out he was wrong. It's not millions of years old, it's billions of years old with a B. However, the fact that he would even say millions was totally against what the church was saying at the time. So we kind of we give him the credit of coming up with geologic time. And he ended up writing textbooks. The Principles of Geology was his textbook. It went through 12 editions. I mean, it was the geology textbook of the day. It focused on processes. It explained how you got fossils on the tops of mountaintops. And the other thing that it did, though, is it totally challenged the view that the Earth was only 6,000 years old. Interesting, don't you think? I mean, he's a little bit of a heretic, So what's the connection with Darwin? Well, Darwin actually had a copy of Lyell's book. He was totally drawn into this book because remember, here's a kid that had a beetle collection when he was young, and he also was studying barnacles, and he actually saw barnacles on the tops of cliffs, not living barnacles, but fossil barnacles living on cliff tops that are 500 feet above the ocean. How did they get up there? All of a sudden, Lyell's book gave him a framework for understanding that mechanism. So armed with this new paradigm of Lyell's book, this concept of geologic time, he took a little trip. Okay, it wasn't such a little trip. It was a 5-year journey aboard the Beagle. And the Beagle was a ship of the Royal Navy, and they started out here in the British Isles, and they traveled all the way down to South America, leapfrogged all the way around South America, ended up in the Galapagos Islands, which is where Darwin did a huge amount of his work, then crossed the Pacific Ocean to New Zealand, to Sydney, Australia, around Australia into the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, back to South America, and then from South America, they headed back to Europe. That was a 5-year journey on the ocean. Sounds like adventure, doesn't it? Except for one major problem. Darwin got seasick. And I don't mean a little seasick. He got very seasick. And if you know you get seasick, you know what I'm talking about. It is the most miserable feeling in the world. Well, 95% of you out there that get seasick, you actually would get over it if you just stayed on the boat for about a week or so. Eventually you'd get your sea legs. Darwin was in the other 5%. He never got his sea legs. He threw up pretty much the entire way across the Atlantic Ocean to South America in that first leg of the journey. It was horrible, okay? Absolutely horrible. So, when they pulled into Bahia here, the very first port, Darwin gets off the boat and gets on his knees and starts kissing the ground. He's just so happy to be on land. Within an hour, he's feeling better. And finally, after they re-provisioned the boat and got all of the stuff back on the boat, the captain says, "Okay, Darwin, we got to get going. We're on a mission here. We got to get going." Darwin, he absolutely refused. He says, "There's no way I'm getting back on that boat. I can't handle it." He said, "I tell you what. Where are you going next?" And the captain said, "Well, we're going to Rio de Janeiro. We're going to continue down to Rio." And Darwin said, "Great. Then here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a caravan of horses. I'm going to meet you there." And that is precisely what Darwin did. In fact, all the way around South America, he only rarely ever got back on that boat. In fact, over the entire 5-year journey, he only spent 2 of those years on the water. 3 of them he spent on land. So this was actually a good thing for us because he spent so much time on land here. He made so many new discoveries, and in light of what he knew of Lyell's book, it really got him thinking. It was really important. So after this Beagle cruise, Darwin never set foot on a boat ever again. He was done with boats. That was perfectly fine with him. But during that 5-year journey, he amassed a huge amount of data. He spent years trying to analyze it all. And it wasn't until about a decade long after his cruise on the Beagle that he began thinking of these new groundbreaking ideas. And the problem was, remember the kind of person he was. He was the guy that got beat up on the playground. He was soft-spoken. He was very scared of the implications because he realized that the data he gathered and the interpretations that he was coming up with that seemed to make perfect sense were against what the church was saying. So Darwin said, you know what, if I am going to present this information and we're going to actually be making changes, then we need more evidence. We need to have some backing here. So he actually began looking at some of his contemporaries. Let me show you an example of one here. This is Sir Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus, not a biologist. In fact, he was actually an economist. And he worked for the king. And the king was faced with some real serious problems at the time. The problem was that the British Isles are a fixed island. The British Isles, the actual land, is not growing. And yet the people of the time, the population, was indeed growing. So the king was faced with this huge problem. How am I going to feed this growing population? he turns to Thomas Malthus, and Malthus says, well, let me work out the mathematics for you. I can actually do this for you. He figures out that, in fact, the situation is totally grim for the king. Malthus argued that as population size grows, the resources end up getting overutilized, and it intensifies the struggle to survive, thus increasing the amount of conflict in the world, and he basically painted this horrible picture for the king. Alright, so that's neither here nor there. We'll come back to Malthus actually in a few weeks. The reason why it was important for Darwin is that Darwin was actually sitting in the audience when Malthus gave this presentation. So it totally influenced Darwin. It provided Darwin with a framework that allowed him to reference all of that information that he had gathered on his voyage of the Beagle. Alright, so in listening to Malthus, here are the ideas that Darwin came up with. Number one, this is one of the observations that Darwin makes. All species have this high reproductive potential. It's just true of all species. Any species is going to produce way more offspring than can possibly survive. And the picture that I'm showing you here is of a coral spawn. This is a coral head right here, and it's producing gazillions of larvae. These are all fertilized eggs that are going off, and they're going to become plankton somewhere and eventually settle out as a coral head. However, not all of these are going to live. In fact, only a few of them are. Well, that seems kind of interesting, doesn't it? I mean, the fact that organisms tend to make far more babies than can possibly survive. So Darwin notices this. And in fact, he refers to something that Malthus brought up. Exponential growth. The fact that in this case, I'm showing you a curve here that we're going to actually learn a little bit later. This is called a J-curve. This is how populations grow when they double. So 1 can give rise to 2, and then 2 give rise to 4, and 4 give rise to 8, etc. All the way down. If you were to plot this over time, it actually shows this astronomical growth rate that actually approaches infinity. So this is the potential that all living organisms have. Now, do all organisms do this? No, of course they don't. But Darwin recognized that they at least do this, that they at least have this innate ability. Okay, why is it that populations don't grow that way for very long? Well, it's because the environment actually limits population growth. It actually creates pressure on the population. When it gets too big, it overutilizes its resources as resources become limited, and in a response, when populations are humongous, reproduction ends up going down and mortality ends up going up. Mortality is the death of organisms. So the bigger the population gets, the greater the amount of death that occurs, and the reproductive rate goes down, and the system ends up resetting itself. This happens in nature. It truly does. And in some cases, a population that far exceeds its carrying capacity, which we'll come back to later, then the population actually crashes, which is extinction, right? So here is another observation that Darwin makes. Life is hard. Yeah, we already know life's hard. I mean, look at these poor penguins. These penguins here are dealing with a really difficult life, right? They're living in really, really cold temperatures, having to travel over huge distances on the ice. And you know what? This is just hard walking. Imagine now getting to your food source in the water. Life's really hard. Not only do you have to deal with things on land, but you got to deal with these guys in the water. Now, it might be nice for everybody to survive. There may be many survivors, but the reality is not everybody gets to live. Right? Not everybody gets to live. So a population of organisms is constantly faced with things that result in death of certain organisms. That's just the way it is. Here's the challenges that organisms face. Number one, alright, you have to deal with the environment. You have to deal with the weather, whether it's too cold, whether it's too hot, too windy, too wet, too dry. All of these things you have to be able to deal with. Okay, let's say that some organisms can't deal with this. They end up dying, but most can. So the survivors, congratulations, you've survived the elements, but now you have to deal with food constraints. Maybe there isn't enough food for you guys. Maybe it's not the right kind of food, or you're not there at the right time to get the food. Now, this is another challenge, right? So certain organisms are going to die from this as well. But maybe you're the one that gets to live, both through the environmental issues and the food issues. Now you have to deal with predators. Maybe there's an organism out there that's really good at eating your kind, or maybe there's a bunch of them out there. All right, so you can see how we're whittling it down here, and the survivors are getting smaller and smaller in number. Now, you guys are competing against each other. Competition. You don't get to live if you're too slow, too weak, too scared, or too dumb. These are the challenges that organisms face, and Darwin recognized this. It meant that as the struggle to deal with all of these issues ensues, not everybody gets to live. All right, here's another observation from Darwin. He was traveling through Argentina, and one of his guides pulls out bones from the hillside. Now, his guide and all the guides had seen this many times. Humongous bones. However, Darwin had been through the museums in London. He knew what an armadillo looked like, the bones of an armadillo, right? He'd had that training. But the guides were pulling out these bones that seemed to resemble living armadillos, but they were like 10 times the size. And in fact, what they were showing him turned out to be the fossils of an ancestor to armadillos called a glyptodon. Darwin was amazed. He's like, glyptodons don't live today. I know that because I know what an armadillo looks like, and yet this thing is the size of a VW bug. So it's a huge organism. What this told Darwin is that there are organisms that used to be alive before that are not alive today. They went extinct, and they seem to resemble living forms today. So where he made his greatest discoveries was on the Galapagos Islands, which are off of Ecuador, and he ends up observing that in fact there are finch species that live out on these islands that resemble each other superficially because they all appear to be finches. However, they all take on a different role in their habitat, and they start doing different things. But to make a long story short, because we're going to come back to these finches a number of times, Darwin recognizes that in fact there were 14 related species of finches that appeared to have descended from a common ancestor. So he called it descent with modification. So we'll cover more of this a little bit later. Another one of Darwin's observations, variation. All organisms have variation. We know it to be true. Darwin saw this in all the organisms on his travels. When you look at a whole population of turtles, they don't all look the same. They've got some variation about them. Indeed, the last time you sat in a classroom and you looked around the room, nobody looked alike, right? We all had differences about us. That's because within the human population, there's a bunch of variation. And what's really cool is that variation is hereditary. You can actually pass that variation onto your offspring. Just to give you an idea, because sometimes when we're looking at populations like a whole bunch of ants or a whole bunch of seagulls standing on the beach, it doesn't look to us like there's variation there. They look like identical clones of each other. And yet, no, there is just as much variation in those seagulls as there are in a population of humans. Just to give you an idea, this is a picture I took at the La Brea Tar Pits, and you're looking at what's called the humerus bone. It doesn't matter what bone it is. It's just one of the bones in your arm. And it's the same bone in an extinct group of birds. And you'll notice that if you went and measured all of these bones, there would be differences throughout these bones. Some are a little longer than others, some are a little thicker, some could withstand being broken a little better than others. But you can see just in a single bone a huge amount of variation from one organism to the next. And the same amount of variation is true in every other feature of this bird. So variation is totally written into a population, into the DNA of that population. Just to give you an idea of why that variation is important and why Darwin really latched onto this as an important point, is that individuals tend to vary. And I'm showing you a whole group of snails here, and hopefully you've picked up on this by now. These are all the same species of snails. They can all interbreed. They can all have babies. And yet, they look different, right? They have some variation about them. And it's true that some of these traits actually convey some sort of an advantage. You could imagine this population of snails living in an area that's on the beach, let's say, and on the rocky shores, but it's kind of cold. Well, if you're living in a cold environment, it's probably a good idea to be a darker shade here, like these snails over here. If you're darker shade, you're going to be collecting more heat, right? Well, what if you're the same population of snails, but you're living off of Florida? Well, you don't want to be too dark there, because if you are, then you're going to get cooked in your shell, instead of these lighter guys here that actually reflect the heat. So all of these colors that you see here have some sort of an advantage under certain circumstances. And the key is the organisms never know what those circumstances are going to be. So we're going to come back to this a little bit later, but just a more real-world example for us humans, there's variation in everything about us. But one way that we vary is in the weight of our newborns. You know, you get some babies on the heavy side, some babies on the light side, right? You know, kind of like this. But obviously, there's an optimal range within which babies are born. If you're too small or too big, think about before medical intervention, you essentially are probably not going to live, and the mothers that end up having babies that are too small or too big also may not live. So it's only those mothers that produce usually on average that nice average size baby. Those are the ones that tend to live into the future. Now, variation. Here's the other key ingredient here that Darwin recognized, is that some of that variation is in fact heritable. So imagine that this is variation among a whole group of something. It doesn't matter. Let's say ants, for example. Well, let's say that this individual here, just because of the conditions of the day, is the winner. It's the one whose babies get to be more prolific. But remember that in order to have babies, a shuffling of the DNA had to happen in meiosis, right? So maybe this is the outcome. These are individuals that look similar to the parent, but not identical, right? Let's say the same thing happens, the environment changes, and that gets to be the winner right there. So you can see how things change kind of over time, and how some of that is heritable. Some of that can be passed from one generation to the next. Okay, this is really, in a nutshell, what Darwin came up with. This is Darwin's big idea. And I'm going to spell them out here for you. There's only 4 real ideas here. Number 1, all species differ in traits that are heritable. Number 2, that difference affects the ability of individuals to survive. So some get to live, but not everybody gets to live. If you get to live, then hopefully you get to reproduce, but not everybody gets to reproduce. Number 3, because species end up producing more babies than can possibly survive, over time, the population is going to change. That is evolution in a nutshell. Very simple, very easy, nothing controversial about it whatsoever. And this is why you guys are uniquely qualified to get this now. So, let me move on now and explain to you what the process here is. We call it natural selection. Natural selection is a very simple concept. It's the idea of differential survival and reproduction. That is to say, you have a population, not everybody gets to live, and those that reproduce, some reproduce more than others. Over time, because of this filtering mechanism that the environment causes, the genetic makeup of a population changes from one generation to the next. So here's the take-home message, and take a look at this this cartoon over here. What I'm showing you here is an example of what natural selection and evolution is not. What you see here are 2 beavers, and you know how beavers behave, right? They go over and they gnaw on trees and knock them over, right? So that's what they like to do. And all of a sudden, here's a beaver who magically appears to have a chainsaw for a hand, and this reads, "Now that's what I'm talking about," as if that's what he really wanted. But this is not how natural selection works. Natural selection does not grant organisms what they need. You simply get what your DNA has. And where did you get that DNA? You got it from your parents. So, unless your parents had a chainsaw for a hand, chances are you're not going to have a chainsaw for a hand. Here's the take-home message. Evolution is this continuous process, and natural selection is one of the mechanisms that drives evolution. Now, we need to kind of focus on the spread of genes now, the spread of DNA. Organisms that have the more favorable traits are tending to survive better, and therefore they tend to reproduce more. So they get to spread more of their babies into the future. And so what traits get passed on? Only those traits that come from the survivors. Those individuals that either died or were unable to reproduce, who cares if they're rich and famous? If they don't make babies, then evolutionarily they're dead. So this big male sea lion here, obviously he's the one that's going to be passing on his genes into the future. Now, individuals that have unfavorable traits, that is, traits that actually hurt your chances of surviving and reproducing, they aren't going to get passed on. Here's an individual here that is not going to be passing on his DNA anytime soon because he's going to be dead in the next few seconds. So it means that only genes for traits that don't kill you are passed on. Here's an example of some really smart people here who are doing us the favor of killing themselves so that they don't pass their genes on. Let's see, there's 1, 2, 3 individuals. That hand is attached to a person, and they're having fun hanging out with the boys in the pool. But they decided, you know what, it's time to do a cookout. We got to get the hibachi out. But the hibachi is a plug-in hibachi. But you know what? The plug just isn't going to reach. I have a smart idea. Let's float the extension cord on my slippers, just like that. Yeah, kind of an idiot, don't you think? These 3 individuals have done us the favor of killing themselves so as not to pass on the stupid gene. I don't actually know if they died, but it makes a good point. Here's how I want you to think of nature. Nature really is just a filter. The environment is a filter. I want you to think about all those things that might prevent individual organisms from surviving and reproducing. The climate, predators, habitat differences, disease, all of these things, so that a population that is having babies and is trying to pass its genes on into the future, some are going to get stopped by that filter, by all of these factors over here. But others are going to pass through. And the question is, what does the future generation look like? The future generation is made up of individuals that were able to survive the environment as it currently stands. Now, why do we not evolve perfect organisms? Well, we don't evolve perfect organisms because the filter, all of these things, are constantly changing. So the perfect combination for one particular generation is not necessarily the perfect combination for the next generation. So, natural selection in a nutshell. Here's what it is, you guys. Darwin's simple steps. Number 1, organisms reproduce more than can possibly survive. Number 2, all populations have variation. Number 3, some of that variation can be passed on to your offspring. It's heritable. Number 4, because of these 3 factors, over time, as the environment changes, because it continues to change, a population is going to end up exhibiting more favorable traits for the present environment. The present environment. But remember, the environment's changing, so the genes are probably changing too over time. We're going to eventually get into this next lecture talking about what this truly means. This means that the frequency of favorable alleles, genes, changes over time. Okay, that's what evolution is. Again, there's no controversy there. It's pretty darn straightforward. So remember, Darwin's writing all this up. He's got all of this great evidence, and he does not publish it immediately. In fact, he's totally petrified of what's going to happen when he publishes it. So he sits on it. Meanwhile, here's this young whippersnapper upstart, Alfred Wallace, and Wallace ends up coming up with the exact same conclusion that Darwin has. But so as to show respect for Darwin, he approaches Darwin and says, hey, I noticed we came up with the same kind of ideas. Maybe you and I should get together and write this up together. Darwin, remember, he's waiting a long time. Turns out it's 20 years, and actually 30 total since his initial observations, since this first came to light. They end up pursuing it together in 1858, kind of, and I should say sort of, because Darwin actually wasn't there when the paper was presented. Alfred Russel Wallace actually is the one that did it. It really didn't get much fanfare in science initially. However, the very following year, Darwin finally published, The Origin of Species. And it sells out on the first day. Not immediately accepted. In fact, there were lots and lots of questions, right? By the 1930s, though, so we're talking another 60 years later, or 70 years later, science matures and gives rise to such fields as population ecology, genetics, game theory, and systematics. So by the 1930s, it's pretty much settled. All of these controversial points in science are no longer an issue. In fact, the controversy surrounding evolution is not in science. The controversy only exists outside of science. So natural selection actually provides this mechanism for connecting all the various disciplines within biology. And, the reason why this was more readily accepted by the scientific community initially is because we already knew that artificial selection could work. We've already seen it happen. We've been breeding chickens, we've been breeding dogs, we've been breeding all kinds of organisms and selecting for particular traits. However, not everybody was convinced, and when they questioned Darwin on issues of heredity, he never really was able to come up with a good answer. And I have here that the smoking gun totally eluded Darwin. Why did the smoking gun elude him? Because he didn't know what the unit of heredity was. Remember this whole idea of blending inheritance. This was Darwin's initial idea, and he stuck to it even though it turned out to be wrong. This whole idea that you have red flowers and white flowers, you mate them together, and they make pink flowers, of course. But when you mate pink flowers with pink flowers, you get red and white back. Well, that totally stumped Darwin. He could never come up with the solution for this one. Of course, you know what the solution was, right? Mendel, right? So Mendel worked out how this happens, and that the units of heredity are actually particulates. He didn't know what they were. You know that they're chromosomes. He didn't know that, and Darwin was even more stumped by all of this. So, what is it that you know that Darwin did not know and Mendel only suspected? DNA and genetics. Very good. That's what makes you actually more knowledgeable about this than even Darwin or Mendel. So, adaptation is what happens to populations as they're faced with different environmental conditions over time. I want you to imagine that this actually can occur both in the morphology, the outward appearance of an organism, as well as its physiology, how the internal chemistry works, or even the behavior. This is all written into your DNA, and DNA gets selected for or against in populations. And it has to be advantageous, or at least not a disadvantage. It has to give you some sort of an advantage in coping with the environment. So natural selection actually allows for producing individuals that are best adapted to a particular environment. And I have two pictures here to kind of illustrate this point. I've got two fish here. I want you to imagine an ancestral fish scaffolding. DNA that gives instructions on how to make a generic fish. Take that DNA in a population of 1,000 individuals and split them. 500 individuals, place them in one kind of habitat, and 500 other individuals, place them in a different habitat, and track those populations over time. Over time, genes are going to get selected for within the two different populations until eventually, even though they might contain the initial scaffolding of how to make a fish, there have been nuances on those scaffolds to produce a fish that might look like this, and a fish that might look like this. That's right, that's a fish, you guys. That's a seahorse living on coral, but it's really well adapted to live on that coral. If you were to take this quote-unquote perfect fish, of course it's not a perfect fish, it's just perfectly adapted for living in that particular kind of habitat, and you were to force it to live like this fish over here, it would be dead in a second. So these are traits that are only specific for the environment in which these fish find themselves. And it is through this mechanism that we arrive at the huge diversity of life on this planet. And so it's neat because these 6 pictures here are of completely different organisms that at the most basic level within their DNA still contain the same initial scaffolding that arose to this level of diversity. They're all a type of organism called an echinoderm. Sea stars over here, sea stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, sand dollars, etc. These are all cousins to each other, and they follow along a similar scaffolding. So here's what I want you to think about. This is actually a nice thinking figure. This is slide number 44. All organisms have variation. All organisms struggle to exist, and all organisms differ in their fitness for a particular environment. And the result is that organisms become more adapted with each generation as you have selection occurring within the population. Isn't that nice? So let's revisit Darwin and Lamarck. Remember why Lamarck's proposal was wrong. What was he missing? He was missing the component of DNA. Why did Darwin turn out to be right? Well, Darwin turned out to be right because he was thinking about survival of the not dead, survival of the organisms that managed to make it through a particular environmental trait or environmental that were able to make it through a particular environmental challenge and managed to come out on the other side and reproduce. We call that natural selection. Now, can you think of something that might force rapid environmental change? What might force that? How about mass extinctions? Yeah, that's actually a really good one. There have been about 5 mass extinctions that have occurred in the last 600 million years. And what usually happens at the terminus of these, so after the mass extinction occurs, there's usually this huge explosion of new life that comes onto the scene that simply fills in the gaps. And we're going to talk about adaptive radiation a little bit later in a different lecture. But there's ample evidence for evolution. There's a huge amount of evidence. And I'm going to just cover some of it here. But I want you to realize that as I go through some of these lines of evidence, the mountain of evidence is growing every single day to the point that there's actually more evidence for evolution today than there is for the theory of gravity. The only reason we don't question the theory of gravity is because it doesn't go against our preconceived notions and beliefs the way evolution does. It's the only reason. There's actually more evidence for evolution than for gravity. So, not only is there modern research going on, but every time a fossil is pulled out of the ground, it's more evidence. We're going to cover a concept called homology and analogy, biochemical evidence, and biogeographic evidence, among other things. Fossil evidence. Every fossil is one line of evidence, and it seems to be that when we look at fossil records in rock strata, the older the rocks, the simpler the organisms. There appears to be some change that occurs over geologic time, which is millions of years, and if we think about generations, right, because we're talking about evolution occurring between populations of one population to another population in the future, as it makes more babies, that there seems to be this evolutionary trend towards complexity in organisms over time. We see that in lots of organisms. I'm just showing you one here, whale evolution. From Pakicetus, that lived about 50 million years ago, all the way through to the modern whale. Pakicetus was a land-dwelling animal. It walked around on land. Gave rise to a series of other whales, ancient whales, that eventually came to Rhodocetus. Between Rhodocetus and the next one, there's actually a number of whale species until you get to Durodon. And from Durodon, we get to another one that I'm going to show you here in a little bit, called Basilosaurus. Now, another evolutionary trend within the whales, the nose. Now, think about a horse. You know where the nose is on a horse, right? It's kind of up near here. Well, 50 million years ago, that's where the nose was on Pakicetus. But as these organisms became more and more aquatic, the nose actually is now located on the top of the head. That's the blowhole right here. This is a modern beluga whale. Well, if this is today, and this is 50 million years ago, wouldn't you expect that somewhere in the middle, let's say 25 million years ago, there should be a whale with a nose kind of somewhere in the middle? And there is. There's Aeducetus right there. 25 million years ago, and it's got nostrils. So now you understand why it is that modern whales still have hip bones, right? Because their ancestors had hips because they walked on land. Now, biogeographic evidence. I'm going to use mammals as an example. We'll come back to mammals a little bit later. But there was this huge radiation of mammals that occurred over the last 65 million years. Why 65 million years? Well, because that's when the dinosaurs disappeared, or most of the dinosaurs disappeared then, giving rise or allowing for mammals to then explode. But actually, mammals have been around a very long time. In fact, mammals have been around longer than dinosaurs, as we will learn a little bit later. But if you go back to about 250 million years ago, which was actually before the dinosaurs even came on the scene, at that time, the planet actually only had one continent, one supercontinent that was called Pangaea. During this time, mammals are found throughout the entire place up here. However, the mammals back then were very ancestral. They contained characteristics that are actually more akin to reptiles. But that as Pangaea broke up, Australia and South America began to split off of it. And during that time, the mammals got divided. There were mammals in South America, there were mammals in Australia, and mammals in North America. The mammals currently found in Australia are of the monotreme variety. One whole group is the monotremes, and there aren't very many monotremes left. There's only 3 species left. And of those 3 species, they fall into 2 varieties. There's the short-spined and also the long-spined echidna, and then the platypus over here. These are ancient mammals that still lay eggs. They have a single opening in their back end. Well, think about it. You actually have 2 holes down there, right? Well, they only have 1, which is more akin to what reptiles have. So ancient mammals. And then in Australia, a whole nother group of mammals emerge, the marsupials. Marsupials are all the pouched mammals, including kangaroos, wombats, koala bears, etc. But on the northern continents, so up in North America, Europe, Asia, and all of that, a new group of mammals emerged called the placental mammals. That includes you and me, lions, your cat, your dog, etc. Well, as Pangaea was splitting up, it isolated groups of mammals to the point where about 135 million years ago, when the first placental mammals were evolving, they were the cream of the crop. They went out and basically outcompeted all of the marsupials and all of the monotremes that were found on these continents. However, placental mammals were never on Australia. They were never in Australia. So that's why, to this day, naturally, that's the only place where we find monotremes and also marsupials, with the exception of one that we'll get to a little bit later. So monotremes and marsupials get isolated down here, and that is why today Australia is the only place where we find them. And the placental mammals have basically dominated all the other continents. The exception to this is that there is one marsupial that is still left in the Americas. And it's a holdout, and you know it very well. It's the possum. The possum is the last marsupial outside of Australia. Okay, anatomical evidence. Homologous structures. What you're looking at here are bone structures of organisms that are related to each other. And they've color-coded them here so that the pink bones are all common. And the yellow bones here are all common, and so are the blue bones and the green bones. Over time, when you have a scaffold, when you have a DNA scaffold, that is exposed to many, many different environmental conditions. Populations change, but they work on that same scaffold. So over time, the front limb of vertebrates like you and me and birds and bats and whales have all changed because we all live in different habitats. So a homologous structure is one that has the same genetic or embryonic origin, even though it serves a different purpose today. So like a whale's limb versus a cat's limb. The bones are homologous to each other, even though they don't necessarily do the same thing. Okay? Another good example of homology is in embryonic development. Here's a chicken embryo, here's a pig embryo. Notice there's some very similar features about them. And this is you. This is a human embryo here. So in embryonic development, there's a lot of things about us that are very similar to the development of chicks, pigs, turtles, cows, you name it, all other organisms, because we share a lot of DNA in common. Another bit of anatomical evidence are vestigial structures. Vestigial means that we don't use them any longer. However, they probably had an advantage at one point. So what are some examples of human vestigial structures? Well, you still have a tailbone, right? What's the purpose? Well, it doesn't serve much of a purpose anymore because it's the remnant of a structure that used to have a very good benefit for us. An appendix, that's another good example. Body hair. What good does body hair serve? Well, I know some people think it's sexy. I don't know. Anyway, just something to think about. These are things that had a purpose at some point in the past, so why do we not just lose them? Well, we don't lose them because remember, it's not all about necessarily about giving us an advantage. It's simply about not killing us. And so if having body hair doesn't kill us, well, then it's still going to persist from one generation to the next, right? Only those things that kill us automatically get dropped out of the gene pool. Same thing with your tailbone. It doesn't do any harm to have a tailbone, and so we still have it. Anatomical evidence of vestigial structures in other organisms is still present, and we can always go back to that pelvis in the whale as an example of that. You might think, well, if there was an advantage to losing your hind legs, then why didn't the loss continue and have whales lose their hips? Well, or their pelvis. Well, remember, losing the legs was an advantage, but there is no further advantage in losing the pelvis, so the pelvis remains, right? And for that reason, we see hip bones actually in certain species of snakes that also don't have hind legs. That's kind of weird, but it's true. And there's also biochemical evidence. If you look at certain genes in your body and compare them to other organisms on the planet, including things like fungi or amoebas or even large trees, it turns out that we all follow the same rules, don't we? Our DNA consists of only 4 nucleotides. Our RNA consists of 4 nucleotides. The genetic code is totally universal, and there are 20 amino acids and 20 amino acids only. No more, no less, and everybody's DNA follows the exact same rules. So you can actually look at certain key genes that code for very important things. Like I'm showing you actually an example here of something called cytochrome C. Don't memorize that, it's not important. Cytochrome C is an important gene in your body, but it turns out that cytochrome C, which is involved in metabolism, is important in lots of other things, including yeasts, moths, fish, etc. But the difference is that over time, cytochrome C, the gene that codes for cytochrome C, actually has changed or modified. And those organisms that are most closely related to us have had fewer changes in their cytochrome C gene relative to us compared to others. Yeasts, they still use cytochrome C as well, but the difference between the human cytochrome C gene and that in yeasts is actually about 51 or 52 base pairs. So that's pretty different, but it still codes for the same protein. In monkeys and humans, it's far less. It's actually only a couple, and in fact, it's the same between us and primates. Okay, now, one last glimpse, because I know a lot of you are thinking about the loss of traits like losing hind legs in whales, or losing a long tail in humans, you might think to yourself, is it that you're losing the DNA on how to make those? And the answer is no. You have not lost the DNA in how to make a lot of these features. Usually what happens over evolutionary time is you gain a gene that turns off the production of those other traits. So that's kind of interesting because it means that every now and then that off gene gets knocked out and you start producing some pretty weird things. We do actually see this. All right, so here's the question: how many nipples do you have? Well, the ancestral characteristic in mammals is to have multiple nipples, right? Well, in humans, that DNA stops it too, right? However, on occasion, that gene which stops nipple production at 2 in humans accidentally gets turned off. Here's a gentleman sporting his third nipple. Alright, so it happens. It's far more common than you think, but these are genetic abnormalities that demonstrate kind of a reversion back to an ancestral trait. And this is actually true also in whales. Remember, whales, we talk about them as having lost their hind legs over evolutionary time, and yet here's an old paper that came from the 1920s noting a whale. This picture up here actually goes with this 1921 paper. This whale that he's showing you here is actually a humpback whale that was caught with hind legs. Kind of weird, humpback whale with hind legs. And here is a picture of a modern sperm whale that has whale buds. Kind of weird. Let's think about what's going on in these whales then. These are organisms which normally don't produce legs as we know them today, and yet they didn't lose the ability to make back legs. What they did is gained a gene that initiated stopping making hind legs. And what has happened in these two whales here is that gene was knocked out and they produced little mini hind legs. Another great example, here's a story that came from from CNN. You can go and actually check out the link. So from November of 2006, in Japan, they actually found a dolphin who was sporting hind limbs, hind flippers back here. Well, what's really weird is that modern dolphins don't have these hind flippers, and yet if you look in the fossil record from dolphins that lived about 25 to 30 million years ago, they all had hind flippers just like that. Isn't that cool? So this is the evidence that evolution actually happens, and you now know the mechanism, right? But we need to go into much greater detail and learn how it happens. And that is the subject of the next lecture. I'll see you all in cyberspace.